Thank you, and welcome to this latest edition of the Elephant Conversations. And today, it's a privilege for me to be joined by Mr. Alan Boswell. Alan is a senior analyst for South Sudan at the International Crisis Group, and he's also a commentator on regional issues on a variety of platforms. And he's a host of the Horn podcast that focuses on issues of the Horn of Africa, and hopefully we'll be able to share a link on that. So welcome, Alan.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you, and we're big fans of what you're doing at the Elephant.
Great. Well, it's great to catch up. I mean, the subject of today's conversation is South Sudan, which is a country that you studied closely, and I just wanted to start with just a general question. What is going on in Sudan? The big peace agreement the agreement that eventually led to the referendum independence in South Sudan was signed here in Nairobi, and things deteriorated pretty quickly. And now, all one hears is war, peace agreements, war, more peace agreements. What exactly is going on in South Sudan right now, Alan?
Yeah, well, thanks, John, for that. I think, as it's going right now, South Sudan has just recently formed a sort of unity government between what were the main warring parties in this long civil war that it's now trying to get out of. I think the simplest way to think about this in a way is that, as you mentioned, South Sudan, had a long liberation struggle. They signed that peace deal in Nairobi in 2005, and then they achieved independence in 2011, and then just some 2 years later, they fell into civil war. And those two things were quite connected. They basically got independence, and then they started, fighting over, in a way, who would control the country. So they turned inward, if that makes sense. And so the civil war was very much one tied to this independence, and tied over who would control South Sudan after independence. So. And then and that was a very brutal civil war. I think in many ways, the elite in South Sudan, it caught them by surprise. I've heard many top leaders there sort of say privately, really we were playing with fire, and we didn't quite realize it. What basically happened is the ruling party, essentially fell apart, and they started fighting, within the ruling party. So you have it's sort of, in some ways it was a classical sort of situation in Africa where the liberation movement takes over, but then in other ways it really diverged from that. And we can talk about some of the ways that it diverged. But so this liberation party, which was always pretty fragmented and had much less control over South Sudan than I think a lot of people thought at the time of signing the CPA, it then fell apart, and basically the army was nothing more than a sort of hodgepodge collection of many of these militia groups, largely on ethnic lines, and the army fell apart, the government fell apart, and they descended into 6 years of really brutal civil war. I mean, the most thorough estimate done, which was an excess mortality survey, suggested that up to 400,000 South Sudanese might have died. So we're talking death tolls that rival, at times rival Syria and other conflicts that got way more attention. And this is in a place that only has maybe 12 million people. No one knows for sure because they never really conducted a full census. But so we're talking just, a really, really brutal civil war. And so at this stage, they had a peace deal. So they fell into civil war. The peace process was really, really troubled. Nor was there much enthusiasm in a way, because the entire peace process was built upon taking the warring parties and then putting them all back in power again, which of course is quite frustrating for South Sudanese and many of their external friends, because it didn't seem to be a way of really moving forward, but they did eventually agree on coming back together and forming they're still in the process right now of forming a unity government. They formed it at the national level earlier this year, and now they're still negotiating over how to appoint the state and county and local governments in a power sharing formula across the country. So that's where we're at right now. But even in that state, South Sudan was troubled before it fell in civil war. There was lots of mini insurgencies, and there were lots of what you could call communal violence, although it has ties to the national politics as well. And that's really still raging in lots of the country. And you still have another insurgency from a group who declined to sign the deal that's going on. So you have a partial peace, you could call it. You do have the main warring parties from the big civil war who've now joined unity government, but it's hardly comprehensive, so to speak.
I mean, you're talking about 400,000 dead estimated. That's a massive figure, going on 500,000. How many refugees are we talking about, and into which countries have they sort of moved into? We've had a very significant South Sudanese diaspora throughout this region, and of course around the world as well, for decades now. And so it's sad to see that that sort of cycle continuing.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the saddest, parts about this. I've spent a lot of time in refugee camps, talking to South Sudanese as they flee from this, and sometimes I'd meet people who would tell me, this was their, 5th time fleeing the country or something, or, you meet an old man who said he fled in the 60s, and then he fled in the 80s, and then he fled in the 90s, and then he just, and then he says, I don't know if I'm ever, this time I don't know if I'll ever make it back, sort of stories, and so, yeah, I mean, I can't fact check myself at the moment, but something like 2 million refugees, I believe. I mean, it's a significant amount of the population, and I'm getting the numbers a bit messed up because there was also a huge amount of displaced. Something like half the population that was displaced either as IDPs or as refugees, and a lot of those went into Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and neighboring Sudan, yes. Which is similar to what happened during its the long civil war that led to its independence. But yes, we're talking hundreds of thousands in single countries. A huge influx into neighboring countries.
You mentioned, Alan, sort of the fragmentary nature of South Sudanese politics anyway, and how that sort of spilled over after independence and affected the party, the army, and the state itself, which fragmented. Who are the primary internal actors in South Sudan in this crisis? As it has unfolded, and has there been a change in the face? I know, President Kiir has been, head of state since the beginning, since the death of John Garang, and Riek Machar, vice president, and left. But who are some of the other key actors? Because it seems as if, as you said, it's quite fragmented. That it's in particular regions seems to be fairly independent, restive activities taking place.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that's been there with this peace process, and also just conceptually when you talk to the neighboring countries who've always been really involved in South Sudan and the major Western donors and stuff, is that they have a hard time seeing other top leaders besides President Kiir and Riek Machar. Both of, and I'll talk more about them both in a minute, but what's interesting about them politically is neither of them, is what you would consider a strong man, at least in sort of a classic sense. And as much as they both lead sort of very unwieldy coalitions, and most of their political moves are about trying to hold that wider coalition together. And so what looks from the outside often like these leaders have, are sort of the top dogs and they can do whatever they want. Most of the peace process was about internal coalition. Okay. It was trying to find a space in which both sides, both of the top leaders could hold together their broader coalition while still signing a peace deal. And that speaks to this very fragmented nature that you're talking about. So there are other political actors. I think maybe a useful way of thinking about it, though, is that in some ways South Sudan is just a very, very diverse country. And if they modeled, if they had sat down and agreed on how to share power amongst all these groups and across the country, before independence or as part of the independence process, we possibly wouldn't be in this state, but instead what's happened is because they didn't do that, you had a sort of, what I've called before sort of king of the hill scramble among these different groups, yes. To kind of contest for who would come out on top after independence, rather than sort of sitting down and negotiating a political settlement among these groups in advance. I mean, I've counted before, depending on how you count, because they all went in coalitions, but there was something, you could say there was some 50 different armed groups at various points during the war who were combined into these bigger groups, you know, but it was at the ground level, it's very fractal. It's very much communities, ethnic groups, clans who sort of mobilize their own militias, and then they join, you know, whatever coalition they think basically is best served to help them. I mean, I think one way of thinking about this in a way, because I think while talking about the top guys is very useful. It also sometimes, I mean, South Sudan, let me say, South Sudan would have a lot of problems if it wasn't just for these top two leaders who get a lot of attention. You know, scholars, you know, so some scholars identify, you know, you can say like three major factors that often lead to civil war, and it's, you know, it's a very weak state. You know, South Sudan is arguably one of the weakest states in the world, and as much as it doesn't have even basic infrastructure, most of its roads turn to mush for half the year. So you can imagine even projecting governance or military control into a place where you can't even travel by road. And it doesn't have institutions really like other, you know, I think liberation movements in Africa took over, you know, sort of successor states, if you will. And I think the degree to which South Sudan didn't really do that and didn't really even have anything to sort of take over at a state level. They had lots of local governance systems and other stuff, but the state level wasn't there. And so, you know, they had a very weak state, and then they were very divided you know, they as a nation in the classic nation sense, you know, they were very divided. They spent much of the civil war actually fighting against each other. This was the Sudanese civil war. I think the narrative is very much, it was the North fighting the South and vice versa, but actually Southerners killed each other more during that war than the Northerners, and the sort of, and many Southerners basically viewed that entire war as much as an internal civil war conflict as much as anything else.
Yes.
And the SPLM, the ruling party, very much gained militarily and legitimacy primarily, like a lot through external actors. So they didn't build quite, you know, it wasn't the same as, say, in Ethiopia, where you had groups really sort of, you know, build from the ground up in a way. You had the SPLA very much sort of got external support and resources, and then used that to sort of grow inside South Sudan. So you have a very weak state, you have a very divided country, among the most in the world on both those factors. And then the third one is just a very high value political center to fight over, basically, what you would call a winner take all political economy, I think. And then on top of that, they had a very winner take all political system in which, you know, sort of whoever got the top seat has basically monopolized the oil wins. So I think that these factors, I think it's worth, you know, looking at. You have these top guys, but structurally, setting up a system like this, without sitting down negotiating in advance was I wouldn't say necessarily doomed to fail, not taking out agency from it, but it was, you know, you created a system in which you essentially had a very, very weak state, a very divided place, and then all the groups had something very valuable to fight over, which is the oil in South Sudan, which is their only oil revenue. And I think those factors sort of is what led us to this point. And now they're in a process of sort of, I think, really figuring out how do they get a national reset? How do they try to move forward as a country? And of course, they are more bitterly divided now than they were, but, you know, at independence. So it's not just a matter of resetting, but, you know, they're in a much worse place than they were, you know, from where they started.
You've mentioned some of the key interesting insight that you just shared, that given this context of you know, the lack of a comprehensive peace settlement prior to independence between all the different groups, and the fact, you know, just the lack of institutions and just state capacity to project itself in terms of service delivery, security, etc., has made for a situation where, you know, everyone talks about South Sudan and talks about Salva Kiir and Riek Machar as sort of the big bogeymen in the international community. But given the context that you're describing, as you said, you know, perhaps the problems would be even bigger if some of these figures weren't there, which is an interesting insight. But you've mentioned the role of external actors. And maybe we can go through some of those. You know, the U.S., particularly the Christian right in the U.S. was very strong in its support for the independence of the South, which was largely Christian and non-Christian, but was dominated very much by Khartoum, the Muslim north, and Sharia was imposed against their will, etc. And so the US has always been a very big player in South Sudan. Can we discuss the role of some of these external actors? Before independence, since independence, I remember visiting South Sudan and was impressed by the sheer scale of the UN mission to South Sudan and the huge investment that came in from the international community, from the West, from assorted European countries, all assisting with all this capacities of state building kind of project by another name that was underway. But can you just give us a bit of an overview of the key external actors before independence and then now since independence, and what's the situation now? I mean, so we can start with the US, but I know Khartoum is obviously is very, very relevant, as is Ethiopia, Kenya, the Gulf.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's sort of the two main categories there, which I'll go into, is very much the Western power is very much led by the U.S. And then the regional states, like you said, the neighbors are continue to be very important, and were very important in sort of creating the system that is there now in South Sudan. And the U.S. and these regional states very much work together. I think South Sudan and especially John Garang, the late founder of the SPLA, who died in 2005, in a very startling sense, right after signing this big peace deal. He was a remarkable politician, really, and not necessarily what I mean internally, but in terms of his ability to really curate these geopolitical coalitions for himself. He started off his career very much being chosen as the leader of this sort of this emerging rebellion, and this was he made an alliance with the Derg in Addis Ababa very early on, and that's how he sort of came. That's how he sort of, it was that support that sort of cemented himself as the leader. And then eventually, what happened is the SPLA became tied into the US's campaign against the Sudanese government. The whole sponsor of terror designation that's still part of the current politics there. But this goes back into the 1990s, when the US started really, identified Khartoum as a public enemy, very high up on the list. And the US formed an alliance with what they called the frontline states. This was Ethiopia, Uganda in particular, sometimes Eritrea, also Kenya, although to a less degree militarily. I mean, not everyone knows this, but Ugandan and Ethiopian troops, fought alongside the SPLA oftentimes inside South Sudan against the Sudanese troops. I've spoken to Ethiopian generals, for instance, who fought alongside the SPLA in South Sudan, and Museveni's forces very much did as well, which is one of the reasons that Ugandan president is still so invested in the South Sudan outcome. They consider themselves part of what went on there. So I think in Kenya was always Nairobi was always a safe place for the elite to come. Yes. A lot of them had their houses here, and that's still the case. But like you said, Kenya played a leading role through the IGAD peace process in negotiating the end, or negotiating the peace deal there. The U.S. part of this is particularly interesting because I think this era of sort of the U.S. as the as almost a hegemon to a degree that other powers hardly even seem to matter at points. That sort of environment from the 1990s and early 2000s, I think is fading, but it can be. It's worth remembering, the U.S. was really the prime driver on a lot of this. And like you said, John Garang formed a really, really smart alliance, bipartisan alliance in Washington, which of course is not easy to do. And that involved the Christian right, as you mentioned. He was, he found, he found church members in George W. Bush's hometown and would write them personal letters and stuff, and then would have those church leaders lobby George W., like members of George W. Bush's church lobby him. You know, I mean, there was like, it was very sophisticated stuff. There was a member of the Congressional Research Service who is now a senior, you know, in the US, who's now a senior advisor to President Kiir now, who was very much from within Congress, was very much a, you know, an ally of John Garang. He called John Garang uncle, for instance. And it was very, you know, so he developed these very close ties. And so it was on the right, you had the evangelicals, and on the left, you had the Congressional Black Caucus, but also just sort of an emerging human rights, you know, sort of lobby, many of whom later rose in the Obama administration. You know, so he was basically covered, you know, when he was covered in both Democratic and Republican side of the aisle, and that external support, you know, proved extremely valuable to him. And I think, and like I mentioned earlier, one of the key takeaways from that is also that, you know, is part of that external support, which included humanitarian aid that the SPLA often was able to divert for its own purposes as well, but also direct military support. You know, a lot of that external support also meant the SPLA never quite had to build up from the ground up and gain the legitimacy, you know, and build a governance system that other liberation movements were forced to. And I think that really showed in sort of how quickly this house of cards fell apart afterwards as well, that how much of this sort of did rely on the external support and you know, probably to the detriment of the movement.
I mean, one of the most compelling narratives also within the region, I know for us in Kenya was, and I think that this is a narrative that was also picked up and also propagated in the US, especially on the right, was a narrative of, you know, of Southern African Christians being enslaved and oppressed by an Arabized Muslim North, and that's been sort of the binary narrative. To what extent was that a narrative that was sort of maybe overplayed and sort of simplified what was actually a far more complicated and fluid situation in terms of identities in the whole of Sudan?
Yeah, it was definitely overplayed, and it was also a very specific political weapon in this fight for geopolitical allies, like you mentioned. It was a very intentional narrative that was put out there by Garang and the SPLA to create this. I mean, obviously in the U.S. as well as some neighboring states, the sort of narrative of a Christian South versus an Arab Muslim North is a useful one. What we've seen, you know, afterwards in South Sudan, and it should have been obvious before, is that, you know, that narrative missed a lot. And I'd say, you know, you can talk in many ways where that dichotomy falls apart, but I think that the main overarching sin of that narrative, if you can call it that, is that it significantly underplayed the divisions within South Sudan. It projected South Sudan as a sort of monolith. It also projected the North as a monolith as well. But it also suggested, you know, there was something there in the South, and also suggested this civil war, like I said, that the SPLA was fighting against Khartoum, was a sort of pan-South Sudan movement in a way that wasn't true on the ground. Throughout the civil war, you had Southern militias fighting against the SPLA. There are many groups in the South, especially minority groups, and in some cases, you know, larger regions that, you know, that from the get-go sort of saw the SPLA as very much a movement directed against their opponents within the South, more so even than against the North, you know, and so the degree to which the South and the SPLA was a much more complicated place, I think, is sort of the main thing that people missed. You know, and the other thing on this is just South Sudan, you know, they really needed to negotiate a broader political settlement, I think, before independence, and they weren't able to. I think the core, I think something that really was a logical fallacy in the US in particular was that the Khartoum government, of course, was looking for proxy and ally forces in the South against the SPLA. So you often had communities who would take up arms against the SPLA, and of course they would receive military support from Khartoum, and sometimes their own agendas would become blended and difficult to separate from Khartoum. But there was a fallacy there in thinking that these forces didn't also arise from actual political grievance on the ground as well, right? So I think the fact that these were quote unquote Khartoum backed, which was true in a way, I mean, they were Khartoum backed, but I think saying that it was all fueled by Khartoum and that this wasn't actually a legitimate internal civil war within South Sudan, that was a major mistake that outsiders made.
Let's talk a little bit about the North, about Khartoum, because they're conflicting narratives. I talked to some friends in the North, and many of them, especially in the intelligentsia in Khartoum, were pretty upset and aghast that they'd lost the South, as it were. That that this Bashir regime sort of incompetent and had lost the South, and yet there's another very strong narrative that the North has been essential in helping to fuel and to finance and to manipulate some of the divisions that have been militarized and have maintained this situation of continuous instability. What would you say is the role of the North now in this last period, especially since the breakout of hostilities in 2013? There are those who paint them exclusively as a malevolent player, actor in this. And the last time I visited Khartoum in 2017, I was struck by the number of South Sudanese who was based there, who sort of commute there, and the fact that the Khartoum government had sort of given them, no need for any visas or anything. So it seems to be a slightly more nuanced relationship than is sometimes just described, as the Khartoum Mukhabarat sort of working for the failure of the South Sudanese state and manipulating the divisions there. Is that
it was. No, it's definitely true. It was always more complicated than that, and and really it shouldn't be a surprise. In many ways that South Sudanese, many of them still consider Khartoum home because that was the capital of their country for a very long time. So there's and obviously the cultural ties. I mean, saying there's a North Sudan and then there's a South Sudan, and as if these are fully distinguishable entities, is obviously life isn't that simple. And so there's a lot of shared culture and obviously a lot of shared history, but also a lot of political alliances. Garang in the SPLM was also forming a pan-Sudanese movement, trying to, he would form alliances in Darfur, he would form alliances in what's now South Kordofan and Blue Nile on the northern side, so this was never, at points it became a South Sudan versus North, but it's not a surprise that these alliances are of course much more complicated. In terms of your question about Khartoum and its role, it's a bit complicated now to say because there was the role that the Bashir government was playing, and then of course now with the transition in Sudan, it's a bit more of a complicated one. But a couple things on that. One is that even during the civil war, when Bashir was still in power, I'm speaking of the South Sudanese civil war now that broke out in 2013, he did back the rebellion against Kiir for a while, but it and that's absolutely true. Riek Machar, who has long-standing ties to the Bashir government, did get some support, and Uganda on the other end very much supported basically President Kiir, and so you had that sort of regional element. As that war dragged on, it became it was probably never entirely binary, but it became increasingly not very binary. The Khartoum government was also strengthening its ties with Juba at the same time. The military hardware flows to Riek Machar really slowed. It never appeared like that. Khartoum didn't look like it was trying to actually overthrow the Juba government. Like it wasn't. They weren't giving that many. That wasn't the level of arms that were flowing in there. At least in the later stages of the war. And so it's much more complicated. You have oil flows that go between the two countries. The oil pipeline from South Sudan goes through North Sudan. You have very strong ties that that are complicated. I think the Bashir government continued to think that a weaker South Sudan was good for them.
Yes.
And so there was an element of sort of keeping it weak. But I think they also realized near the end that a collapsed South Sudan was actually more of a headache to them than what it was worth. So I think you started to see that calculus sort of shift, that, you know, the huge refugee flows and also the many challenges of having a state that's within civil war on your border, you know, also started to become a problem. So I, you know, and I think there is some reflexes there, given the old ties and military intelligence and stuff that took over at the beginning, that sort of changed. Now after, and then the other thing is, then it was the Bashir government that really negotiated this 2018 peace deal, that led to the formation. So to call them, I mean, it was really Bashir working together with Museveni to really force, you know, it was the two main sort of outside backers of opposing sides coming together and really bring these guys together. So a lot of these simplistic narratives, you know, kind of fall apart. Sudan and Uganda are perhaps the most involved in the peace process out of the countries. Of course, they also have their own national interests. So it's not to say they're benignly involved for the good of the South Sudanese people per se, but to say they're all just malignant actors, it's more complicated than that. Now, after the fall of the Bashir government, we've seen a Khartoum government that's, you know, kind of split between the civilian side and Hamdok, and then the military side. I'd say the military side, I mean, both sides, the military side still has longstanding ties to both, you know, Kiir and Machar. It's a bit more complicated, and I think Hamdok has very much, you know, primarily been focusing on his sort of domestic politics, and of course there's the Nile waters dispute. There's many regional issues, but you know, he has a lot on his domestic plate as well. So I'd say at the moment it's a bit more complicated.
If I could just ask about you know, the role of actors like Uganda and Ethiopia. You've mentioned that, you know, they're key sponsors of the 2018 peace deal, but, you know, and that Ethiopian and Ugandan troops actually fought alongside the SPLM. Now, they, you know, especially in Ethiopia, I mean, big changes have happened in Khartoum. Big changes have happened in Ethiopia as well. And so I just wanted to ask, you know, what the kind of role being played by you know, powerful regional actors in that context, like Ethiopia and Uganda, as the conflict sort of continues.
Yeah, and you know, I think a lot of people, because of the history and of the U.S. in South Sudan, sort of assume the U.S. is still the main prime actor. And of course, they spend a lot of money there, but politically and diplomatically, they've really quite withdrawn. At the moment in South Sudan, it really is the regional neighboring countries who are the main external actors at the moment there. And so I think it's, you know, and it's something we've really focused on with our work at Crisis Group. You know, I mean, the quote unquote guarantors of this peace deal is IGAD. You know, and it's very much, and within that context, it's very much Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, you know, and with a possibly sort of special role for Sudan and Uganda, since they teamed up most specifically to sort of bring together this peace deal. So they're very much, the region's very much in the driver's seat in terms of this. The problem is that this isn't a huge priority for any of the regional countries. B, like you said, there are massive, you know, political quakes going on around the region, not to mention the pandemic. You have, you know, just huge political transitions going on in Ethiopia and Sudan, both. And then, you know, and everyone else is dealing with their own internal crises as well. So the regional approach has not been characterized by sort of sustained focus. It's been characterized by sort of occasional, you know, parachute diplomacy, if you will, you know, sort of flying in, firefighting. And so that's been the real challenge, is sort of the two sides will get deadlocked, and they stay deadlocked for a long time. And then, you know, months or sometimes even a year later, if the heads of state in the surrounding countries get together and basically sit the two down and find a way forward. But, you know, sometimes a lot of South Sudanese can die basically in the interim, you know. So I think it's a real challenge this region has faced compared to other regions on the continent, in terms of finding a way of really making the peace and security architecture work. You know, IGAD, when you compare its track record to ECOWAS, you know, or SADC, you know, I mean, it's very difficult to compare them, because they've had a much more difficult time in this region, sort of getting those peace processes to work as well.
You know, what's the role of oil in all this? I mean, you know, South Sudan, I mean, at the very start of at independence, you know, the one thing that South Sudan had that many states at at the start, don't have is a steady sort of revenue stream of foreign exchange coming in from oil. And so people said, okay, a lot can be done with goodwill. A lot can actually be done fairly quickly. You're not starting. You have the cash in the bank to do the stuff, to build the roads, the hospitals, the schools. That did not happen, and the oil is now actually described as actually having perhaps been more of a problem for an independent South Sudan, that the resource curse kicked in before the state could even begin to organize itself into a coherent entity that could manage those resources.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting point you make, and I think it's one that actually policymakers especially should really reflect upon, as well as South Sudanese. But it's ironic because, like you said, South Sudan was considered a quote-unquote viable state, and I'm not suggesting it's not viable now, but it was considered quote-unquote viable state largely on the basis that it had this stream of oil revenue. But when you break down sort of what the conflict was about, how it was fueled, and what that oil money actually went to, the oil seemed to, they fought over the oil as much as anything else. It created this sort of need for everyone to try to negotiate a power position in Juba, because it was the only place, it was a very all or nothing sort of political structure. So it was very destructive to the sort of overarching, political economy. And it was basically looted from the very beginning, billions and billions of dollars. Sometimes you're a figure of $20 billion. I mean, it's an insane amount of money that basically flowed through Juba in very, very short fashion with almost nothing to show for it. The one major highway the country has was built, from Juba to Nimule was built by the US, at the cost of several $100 million. And so oil, played a arguably quite destructive role. I had again, going back, I once had this discussion with, a leading, a liberation movement leading figure in Ethiopia of the EPRDF, and I asked him, well, what went different, and there's many answers to that, but one of the interesting things he said is, we took over a state, but we had no money when they took over in Addis, and he said in South Sudan, they had all the money and they had no state, and I just find it interesting that sort of sequencing, and also I find it interesting that the thing that was identified as making it quote unquote viable and other things, actually, you can make, the reverse argument that it was actually maybe the most destructive thing to do to a very young country that still hadn't built up any institutions, hadn't reached a broad political settlement yet, and then you threw all these billions of dollars on the table to fight over. It proved quite destructive.
Just, time has flown, Alan, and I still have, I'm sure we can go on for another hour on this, but I wanted to ask you just last sort of, closing question that's about the prospects for South Sudan. I'm sure this is something that you think about as you research this country in depth, but I want to frame it in the context of a question of, I mean, it's slightly hypothetical, but what would likely have happened had John Garang not died in the mid-2000s? Because, when I had the honor of meeting him, the vision he had for the South wasn't of an independent South. And perhaps if we were just to contemplate what was his vision, and perhaps deviating from that, perhaps led us down a path that has brought us to grief.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question, as you can imagine, that gets batted around quite a bit, and it's obviously a hypothetical one that can't be answered. It's also, I think, a very interesting one. And I think sometimes people forget that John Garang, while very much a charismatic and during his lifetime, very transformative leader in many respects in South Sudan, he never was actually campaigning openly, and some would say never even privately, for the independence of South Sudan. The SPLM was Sudan People's Liberation Movement. He very much saw himself as building he called it the New Sudan vision, as sort of a secular Sudan, one in which diversity was celebrated rather than this sort of, Arabized national identity. These were the sort of the vision he promoted, and the CPA, which he negotiated in Nairobi shortly before his death, it did have the independence referendum, but before the independence referendum was an election in Sudan.
Yes.
So it was an election in Sudan for the presidency and other things, and then after that came the independence referendum.
Yeah.
I think John Garang very much, he planned on running for president of Sudan. That was the job he wanted. In some ways, I think the independence referendum was sort of, it was partly to placate, South Sudanese, because many, although John Garang was very much pushing this pan-Sudan, an independence movement for South Sudan was very popular in the South. So I'd say Garang was a bit of probably a minority in that respect. But in many ways, that referendum, I think, was going to serve as a sort of insurance policy for him to really kind of, if you don't give this free and fair election, and give him a fair shot at running for presidency, well then, we have a chance to just like call it quits, so to speak. So people forget, that would have just been a very different thing. It's possible, South Sudan would have got independence. A lot of people also just think that, the CPA might not have survived 6 years if John Garang had, I think in some ways ironically, South Sudan got independence because of the weakness in a way. It wasn't challenging the North. They sort of there was sort of a detente that was formed between Kiir and Bashir after Garang's death, in which the separation of the country sort of benefited both of them in their own ways. It allowed both of them to strengthen their own hold internally. And I think those dynamics might have been quite different with Garang. The other thing, and in fairness to President Kiir, is that, Garang, there are many groups that were in South Sudan that were outside the CPA. That this was not a peace deal between the South Sudanese and the Khartoum government. This was a deal between Khartoum and the SPLA. So these other groups within South Sudan were not part of it. Kiir, after Garang's death, I think partly from a position of relative weakness compared to Garang, he went to negotiate with these groups and brought them into the South Sudan tent in a way that John Garang might not have. It could have been a period of continued war in the South, after the signing of the CPA, if, in under different circumstances. But I think obviously when people look at this now, they see Garang as a leader, which I think is true in many of these respects, that, South Sudan doesn't, they don't have a sort of visionary leader. And I think John Garang, despite faults, and I think the idea that he was, very tyrannical in many respects, is in terms of his internal administration is quite true. But, I don't think you can accuse him of not having a vision, and he knew geopolitics. He was a very sophisticated political actor. He was able to form these grand alliances, and it is sort of after his death, that vacuum has never really been filled by the other people within his movement.
Last question, Alan. Prospects. It all looks quite grim, actually. They've been in war since 2013. It starts and stops. A lot of people, a lot of civilians have lost their lives. Huge numbers of people have been displaced internally and into the region. These peace deals keep on seeing meetings. They form coalition governments, but it doesn't seem to really stick. So what are the prospects? Do you see sort of indications within the elite in the South of a coming together of a group that can actually be able to think their way out of the current conundrum?
Sure. One of the saddest parts of this civil war and this state building process, if you will, to a degree, is that South Sudanese had a lot of local governance systems and community structures, that they've been using, some of which had evolved more recently, but had roots going, way back. And, part of building the state, which it hasn't really done successfully, has also been to sort of erode a lot of those local community structures that were also there. And so I think, there's a couple ways to answer that question. I think more than anything, South Sudan needs a national reset. I think the sort of zero-sum politics that's defined this peace process, given the scale of the challenges South Sudan faces, is just not going to cut it. It needs a sort of, it needs a national consensus. South Sudan's a place where without, I call it a big tent or bust sort of cycle, which is like really because it's a place in which the state can't really project force everywhere and it's so divided. It's really a place that it's more of a political union, than a unitary state, so to speak. And it really only operates peacefully with consensus and accommodation. And that's not the political system South Sudanese have built. And I think oil hasn't helped that, because there's a huge incentive to not share power in South Sudan. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned it's difficult. So I think really South Sudanese, they're going to have to, the elite are going to, they really do need to sit back and think about what they want. Because sure, they can continue to bicker over oil, and many of them will get rich, and that, and many, pessimistically think that's what will happen. But also that's a road that sort of leads nowhere. A South Sudan that many, South Sudanese aspired for with its independence is going to require, a much less tit for tat sort of politics, and a much more a broader vision, and a real honest look at what sharing power in South Sudan looks like given the state. I think forms of devolution and forms of more permanent power sharing. I think in some ways South Sudan has radical challenges that should require creative thinking. I don't think it should just sit there and adopt cookie cutter models that they get from the sort of state building apparatus. I think it should be one that very much South Sudanese sit down and decide what will work in their country. Now, if that doesn't happen, and this leads to what I said at the beginning in terms of local, I think South Sudanese should continue to insist and push for and outside donors, especially, everyone should think about ways of trying to, if the state project isn't working, how to create spaces for South Sudanese to at least be able to continue with their livelihoods and survive, and not at least destroy what's there on the community levels as well. I think this constant process of trying to rebuild a giant national army in South Sudan, which is primarily predatory against its own population, and is what fell apart and created the civil war in many degrees. It's something that is seen as part of state building. You have to build this giant national army, but it's a bit unclear why South Sudan benefits at all, at least the South Sudanese people, from having one. So I think there's some fundamental rethinks that need to be done, and I think for South Sudan to work, it require this sort of elite consensus on finding a national reset and moving forward, and otherwise, in the meantime, thinking about how to really give South Sudanese the civic space to discuss these things, but also at local levels, a sort of space to just continue on with their lives. It is something that needs a lot more focus.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. Our time is up, sort of rushed past. This is a very fluid situation, so we'll be coming back to you. So thank you very much, Alan Boswell, Senior Analyst for South Sudan at the International Crisis Group. You can also catch him on his podcast, The Horn. And thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be coming back. As I said, it's a fast flowing situation. Thank you for speaking to the Elephant.
Yeah, John, it was my pleasure. Thanks very much for that.